"Mom, eat this first. I made it especially for you," my daughter said, placing the plate in front of me. Her smile was calm. Too calm. I picked up my fork. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, warm pastry, and rain tapping softly against the windows. An ordinary evening. An ordinary family dinner. And in that exact moment, I smelled something that didn't belong. Bitter. Metallic. Foreign. I froze, the bite stopping halfway to my mouth. And then her husband suddenly began to choke. At first, softly, like he had swallowed wrong. Then his body jerked violently. The fork clattered to the floor. His eyes rolled back, his lips turned blue, foam spilling from his mouth. Someone screamed. Someone jumped up. Someone called my name. But I didn't move. I was staring at the cake, realizing with horror one terrible truth. That slice was never meant for him. I'm glad you're here. Please subscribe, like, and write in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I learned that night might save someone's life. That evening, on that strange midweek Friday when it felt like life was still wide open and unthreatened, everything appeared painfully normal. The rain had started sometime after dusk, soft and steady, tapping against the windows as if asking permission to stay. The kitchen lights cast a warm yellow glow, the kind that makes even tired faces look kind. The radio played low, an old station I had listened to for years, the same voices, the same songs, the same sense of continuity. Emma moved easily around the kitchen, humming to herself. She set the table with care, aligning the plates, adjusting the napkins, wiping already clean surfaces with a towel she kept twisting in her hands. She joked about work, about the traffic, about how she almost forgot the cake in the oven. Michael sat across from me, scrolling through the news on his phone, occasionally shaking his head and commenting on some headline. He looked relaxed. Safe. At home. And I remember thinking, very clearly, how lucky I was. Lucky to have a daughter who invited me for dinner. Lucky to sit at a table where no one raised their voice. Lucky to belong somewhere after so many quiet years alone. I had no idea that this was the last moment my life would ever feel uncomplicated. I notice things. I always have. Small habits. Shifts in tone. The way people touch objects when they're nervous. Emma kept wiping her hands on the same towel, even when they were dry. She insisted, too insistently, that I take the first bite, repeating it twice, laughing it off as nothing. She cut the cake carefully but never once lifted her own fork. At the time, none of it felt dangerous. Just odd. Just human. The cake sat between us, steam still faintly rising, the scent of apples and sugar filling the room. I remember the exact pattern on the plate beneath it. I remember the sound of the rain growing heavier. I remember thinking how peaceful it all was. And how wrong I was. I lifted the fork toward my mouth, and the scent hit me full force. Bitter. Metallic. Wrong. My chest tightened. My pulse jumped. That familiar sense of unease, that instinct I had always learned to trust after decades of living carefully, screamed at me. Something was terribly, dangerously wrong. I pushed the fork away, my hands trembling slightly. I could hear Emma laughing softly at some remark she made to Michael, but it didn't reach me. My mind was somewhere else entirely, focused on the smell, the look, the tension I hadn't been able to name until now. Without thinking, almost automatically, I swapped my plate with Michael's. It was instinct. Survival. Motherly intuition screaming louder than reason. I had to protect someone. Even if it wasn't clear who was in immediate danger, I knew what I smelled. 3 minutes later, it happened. Michael's body convulsed violently. His hands gripped the table edge as if to hold on to reality. His face went pale, lips turning a shade of blue that made me catch my own breath. The fork slipped from his hand, clattering onto the tiles, mingling with the sound of his panic. He coughed, choked, and for a moment, time stopped. I didn't move. I only watched. My heart thumped painfully in my chest. I couldn't speak, couldn't call for help. My mind was replaying every detail from the moment Emma handed me the plate, the subtle way she smiled, the insistence that I eat first, the fact she never touched her own slice. All those tiny things, once harmless, now screaming the truth in my ears. Seconds felt like hours. I saw the look in his eyes, wide, terrified, pleading. My stomach knotted. I felt a cold, crawling certainty that the chemical burning his throat and searing his body was no accident. It was deliberate. Planned. Precise. Later, the doctors told me that the substance could have killed him in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. A sliver of time that could have been the difference between life and death. I remembered the exact odor, the metallic undertone that lingered too long, the faint chemical sourness beneath the sweetness, and I realized that trusting that feeling had saved both our lives. If I had ignored it, if I had taken that first bite, if I had hesitated to move his plate, I would be telling a different story now. I would be mourning someone I loved, and staring at a perpetrator who laughed behind the same smile I had trusted. I sank into the chair opposite, trying to steady myself. My hands shook uncontrollably. Sweat prickled along my spine. I was acutely aware of every small detail around me, the flickering light, the pattern of the rain against the window, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Ordinary details that suddenly felt like a fragile shield between chaos and me. I looked at Emma, standing too close to the kitchen counter, pretending to adjust something, but I could see the tautness in her posture, the way her fingers twitched. She didn't know yet that I had understood. She didn't know that instinct had overridden politeness and saved a life. But I knew. And in that moment, I realized something else. I had underestimated her for too long. I had assumed that my love, my protection, my trust would shield both of us from any real threat. But love doesn't guard against malice, and trust can be a weapon in the wrong hands. I had lived too many years thinking that a smile and a kind word meant safety. That evening shattered that illusion. The truth was raw, biting, undeniable. I was in the presence of someone who could harm the people I loved and planned to do so. I stayed there, frozen, for several minutes, waiting for the adrenaline to subside. The first responders weren't yet called. Michael's breaths were ragged, shallow. I grabbed a napkin, pressing it to his lips, trying to help him focus, trying to ground him in life while my mind raced 1,000 miles an hour. I kept repeating to myself, trust the instinct. Trust the smell. Trust the tiny voice in your chest that knows the difference between safe and deadly. That voice had saved a life. That voice would not lie. Emma approached then, cautiously, as if sensing something had changed, and I could see the calculation in her eyes, the same eyes that had carefully measured every word, every gesture, every plate of food. But I didn't look at her. I focused on Michael, on the life I had preserved, on the understanding that I could never unsee what had just happened. The night had shifted in a heartbeat. The ordinary warmth of a midweek dinner had transformed into a battlefield. And I was acutely aware that surviving it wasn't enough. Knowing the truth, who had placed the danger, why, and with what intent, was only the first step. Later, when Michael's color returned and the paramedics assessed him, I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity. The bitter, metallic trace of poison in my memory was proof. Evidence. A signal that the person I had trusted most in the kitchen that night was capable of deliberate harm. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that nothing in our lives would ever feel safe again. That smile, those gentle gestures, all of it had been a mask. And behind it, a predator waited. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen long after Michael was taken to the hospital, replaying every detail. The plate swap, the odor, the hesitation, the fear. Every second had saved a life. Every second revealed a truth that could not be ignored. I realized something painful. Intuition is the quietest weapon we possess, but sometimes, it's the only thing standing between life and death. And in that realization, I felt a strange, chilling empowerment. I had survived the first strike. And now I knew I would have to be ready for whatever came next. When I held Michael's trembling hand in the hospital, my own fingers wouldn't stop shaking. My chest felt crushed, as if every beat of my heart pushed air into a weight I could not lift. His breaths were shallow, his eyes wide with fear, and the stark hospital lights made the room feel unreal, like a theater set where the drama was all too real. I stared at Emma in the hallway, her posture casual, her arms crossed as if nothing had happened. Her face was pale, lips pressed together in a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. That moment drew me back to something I had long buried. I remembered her as a little girl. Lonely. Fragile. Afraid. The same small, trembling girl I had once promised to protect. She had clung to me in ways I didn't understand at the time, her small hand seeking safety in mine. And back then, I had believed I was the rescuer, the shield between her and the world. After my husband died, I had been alone. The house felt too large, empty, and cold. Silence sat in every corner, the creaking floors and whistling wind the only companions. Life was routine but hollow: wake, eat, work, sleep. Loneliness had become a quiet, heavy companion. Then Emma arrived, a child left to navigate a world that often seemed cruel, and I became her anchor. I thought I was saving her. In truth, she was saving herself. And in saving herself, she had learned the very art of survival I had honed over decades: the careful watchfulness, the silent calculation, the ability to manipulate without remorse. I had raised a clever, cunning mind, and I had done so believing it was for protection, for love. But that cleverness could bend toward harm, too. I thought about the early years, Emma's eyes darting, scanning every corner, every adult, learning quickly who to trust, who to please. The way she would read people, absorbing mannerisms and tone, cataloging small reactions like data points. I believed that attentiveness was innocence, that her calculating gaze was simply intelligence. I had no idea, at the time, that the same skills would later turn against the very family who nurtured them. Her first lies were small: an extra cookie eaten in secret, a broken vase blamed on someone else, but I excused them. I rationalized, I smoothed over the edges, telling myself that childhood needed room for mistakes, that love meant tolerance. And every time I excused her, every time I protected her, I reinforced the belief that she could act without consequence. The rabbit died one spring without explanation. Her friend fell during recess. Small accidents, or so they appeared, but the pattern was there. I saw the teacher's warning once: she's very smart, and very cold. I dismissed it, defending her, believing that love required me to shield her from judgment. Even when money disappeared from my accounts, even when her first husband left under strange circumstances, I made excuses. Because I was afraid of the truth. Afraid that admitting it would unravel everything I had built around her. I remembered my own feelings at the time. Pride, hope, unconditional love. The belief that a family's bond could outweigh greed or malice. I had been patient, trusting, loyal. And yet all of those qualities had been exploited. My love had become a blindfold, my protection a tool for manipulation. Holding Michael's hand now, I felt the convergence of every lesson I had learned and every mistake I had ignored. I realized that this night, this exact moment, was the culmination of decades of misunderstanding and misplaced devotion. The instincts I had honed over years, the careful observation, the attention to nuance, had finally signaled danger. And in that signaling, I had found the edge of survival. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear, of unwashed sheets and too bright lights. I felt the weight of all my years pressing down, the victories, the losses, the quiet sacrifices no one had acknowledged. And in that weight, a clarity emerged: I could no longer simply protect blindly. I could no longer trust without proof. I could no longer assume that love was a shield. It could be a weapon. That night, I left the hospital room for a moment, standing alone by the window. The rain had stopped. Street lights reflected on the wet pavement, creating a lattice of light and shadow that mirrored my thoughts. I traced the patterns, counting the lines of water, the echoes of my own breath. Every step I had taken to build, to nurture, to trust, had been scrutinized by someone I thought I understood. And in the reflection of that wet glass, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge it. Emma, the child I had loved, the young woman I had defended, had grown into someone capable of calculating harm with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to exploit weakness. She had been learning from me, observing me, studying me. The revelation was bitter, crushing, and yet empowering. Because if I could see it now, I could act. I could reclaim the agency I had inadvertently surrendered. The same instincts that had saved Michael's life tonight would guide me forward. And forward, I realized, was the only place to go. I turned from the window and walked slowly back to Michael's bedside. Every detail of the room, the pale green walls, the beeping monitors, the faint scent of antiseptic, anchored me to the present. I touched his hand again, squeezing it lightly. His pulse was returning, steadier now. The chaos of minutes ago had faded, but the lesson remained: trust the instinct, honor the warning, and never assume safety where it doesn't belong. And in that moment, I made the unspoken decision: I would remember everything. Every look, every gesture, every tiny deviation from the ordinary. Because remembering was the first step in ensuring survival. At first, Emma seemed perfect. Polite, caring, charming in a way that made everyone smile and nod. She laughed at the right moments, helped when asked, and moved through life as if it had been scripted just for her. Everyone said the same thing: what a wonderful daughter. And for years, I believed it. I wanted to. I needed to. But the cracks were there from the beginning, subtle, almost imperceptible. I saw them and ignored them, rationalized them away, excused them as childhood mistakes or youthful misjudgments. The first hint came with our pet rabbit. It died suddenly, inexplicably. No sign of illness. No reason. Just gone. Emma cried, of course, but not as I would have expected. Her tears seemed rehearsed, a display rather than raw grief. I told myself it was coincidence. It wasn't. Then came her friends. One of them had a random accident, a slip, a fall. Emma watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. Teachers commented on her brilliance, her precocious intelligence, but also on her coldness, the way she calculated reactions and anticipated consequences. "She's very smart, and very cold," one said once, with a tone I should have taken to heart. I didn't. I dismissed it. I defended her. Even when money disappeared, even when her explanations felt strained or implausible, I protected her, telling myself that love required belief. I remember the first husband. He had been charming, warm at first, until the small details started to add up. Phone calls I wasn't meant to see, accounts mysteriously overdrawn, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. And then he was gone. I excused it. Not my place, I told myself. The second husband followed a similar pattern, though more subtle. Arguments I didn't hear, small manipulations, debts left unpaid and blamed on circumstance. And again, I made excuses. Because the truth was terrifying. The thought that the girl I had loved, nurtured, protected, and fought for could be capable of calculated harm felt impossible. I did not want to believe it. Red flags multiplied. Small things, almost innocuous on their own, yet forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. Gifts never thanked for, money borrowed with vague promises, unexplained absences, manipulations thinly veiled as concern. Even in moments when logic screamed at me, my heart refused to acknowledge danger. Love was stubborn, blind, and forgiving. I protected her at my own peril. Yet it wasn't just the past that warned me. I remembered the present, that night at the dinner table. The cake, the smell, the insistence that I eat first, the way she avoided her own slice. The pattern repeated, magnified, control disguised as affection, observation disguised as care, manipulation disguised as family. I had nurtured her brilliance, shielded her vulnerability, and in doing so, inadvertently trained a predator. Every lie I excused, every fault I overlooked, every indulgence I permitted had been a lesson in strategy, in patience, in calculated action. She learned. She absorbed. And now she wielded those skills with lethal precision. My own naivety was part of the danger. I wanted to believe in innocence, in the goodness I had invested in her. I wanted to see the little girl I had promised to protect. But that girl had vanished beneath layers of cunning, ambition, and indifference. I had made space for her talents, but I had also made space for her disregard, her ruthlessness, her willingness to harm. I thought of the small incidents again, the odd coincidences that had seemed trivial, the vanished checkbook, the disappearing sums from my accounts, the unexplained accidents around the house. I had always rationalized them. Until tonight, when the metallic scent of poison made me freeze, and her husband's convulsing body confirmed every instinct I had ever ignored. I realized then that protecting her unconditionally had been a mistake. Trusting her without boundaries had been dangerous. Love without vigilance had become a weapon pointed at those I cared for most. And yet, the awareness of her capability was paired with a recognition of my own strength. I had instincts honed over decades, intuition sharpened by experience, attention to detail, patience learned through survival. I had acted when it counted. I had saved a life. That knowledge was a seed of power I had not allowed myself to recognize before. I remember sitting later that night, staring at the ceiling in my quiet room, replaying every small incident, every odd gesture, every unexplained event. The red flags, once isolated, formed a map. A blueprint of her mind, her strategy, her methods. The child I had loved, the girl I had protected, had grown into someone I could no longer save by kindness or trust. And in that moment, clarity arrived. I could not undo the past, but I could protect myself. I could no longer be blind. I could no longer excuse the unexcusable. And the woman I had once believed was innocent had revealed herself fully. I closed my eyes and allowed the weight of it to settle. Love does not mean ignorance. Protection does not mean submission. I had to see clearly, act decisively, and trust only my instincts from now on. The predator had entered the room, but I was not defenseless. I had survived the first strike. And the lesson was clear: vigilance was the only currency that mattered. After the hospital, I returned to her house alone, under the cover of darkness. The streets were wet and reflective, neon signs casting distorted light across the asphalt. My pulse was steady now, but my mind raced. I knew I had survived the first strike, but survival was only the beginning. I needed proof. I needed clarity. I moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb the shadows. Drawers, closets, files, I examined them all. Every corner could hide a detail, every shelf could conceal intent. I opened cabinets, shuffled papers, checked under furniture. It felt like peeling back layers of her mind, layer by layer, revealing the architecture of deceit she had so carefully constructed. In the study, I found a safe tucked into the corner, its presence previously unnoticed, almost camouflaged among bookshelves and stacks of papers. My hands trembled slightly as I noted its weight, its lock, and the faint scratches around the dial. Beside it lay several flash drives, neatly labeled, their contents unknown. Insurance papers were scattered across the desk, meticulously organized, yet threatening. I flipped through them slowly, noting names, dates, and amounts. Everything was connected. Every transaction, every document, every number was a node in a web that led back to her. Then I found a list of names. I held it in my hands, reading each one carefully. Neighbors, colleagues, old acquaintances, people I barely remembered. And at the bottom, written in the same neat handwriting that had crafted so many letters and notes I had once treasured, was my own name. Next, Mom. The words sent a shiver down my spine. The reality of the situation hit with devastating clarity. I had been living in the presence of a predator. One who had learned from me, observed me, and calculated every move with precision. The people around her, the facades, the ordinary life I thought I knew, it had all been an illusion. I backed away slowly, my mind racing through every interaction we had ever had. Every insistence, every joke, every polite smile. I had excused, rationalized, and forgiven too much. And in doing so, I had provided the perfect cover for someone who had honed manipulation into an art form. The house felt different now. Each shadow seemed heavier, each floorboard a warning. I realized how often I had walked these same halls, blind to the threats they contained. I had been naive, trusting, loving, and that had brought me to the edge of harm. I knew I had to act carefully. Panic would be a weakness. Thoughtless moves would alert her. But the evidence I had found, the safe, the flash drives, the insurance documents, the list, was power. Knowledge, once in hand, could become my shield. I left nothing untouched. I documented every finding, noting times, locations, and potential relevance. Each detail was another piece of the puzzle, another thread to unravel the intentions that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The night deepened outside, the wind rustling through the trees, carrying the faint smell of rain and wet asphalt. Inside, I was meticulous. Every drawer I opened, every paper I examined, was an act of reclamation. I would not be a passive observer any longer. The predator would not be allowed to dictate the terms of our lives. Finally, I paused, taking stock of what I had gathered. The weight of it was heavy, almost tangible. But for the first time, I felt the stirrings of control. I had been cornered, yes, but now I had information, insight, and foresight. I could plan. I could act. I could protect myself and anyone else in danger. The house, once familiar, now felt like a map of threats and vulnerabilities. Every door, every lock, every habit observed in the quiet hours of the night was a clue. I traced her patterns, the routines, the small tells that revealed intent. She was careful, yes, but not infallible. No one is, not even someone who has spent years perfecting manipulation. By the time I left, the first hints of dawn were brushing the horizon. The world outside was quiet, unaware of the storm that had been simmering in that house for years. I stepped onto the street, the cool morning air filling my lungs, a sharp contrast to the tension that had dominated the night. I knew the next steps were crucial. Every choice would determine whether I remained at risk or seized the advantage. And I understood something fundamental: love had its limits. Trust had its boundaries. And sometimes, survival required the courage to see clearly, act decisively, and protect oneself above all else. That night had changed everything. It had exposed the predator, revealed the danger, and awakened the awareness I had long buried beneath hope, forgiveness, and maternal love. The stakes were clear. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight of power in my own hands. The next morning, I made the call. Every detail from the night before was meticulously documented, every note precise, every observation clear. I gave everything to the authorities, providing not just testimony but evidence: the safe, the flash drives, the insurance papers, the list with my name at the bottom. I handed it all over to Detective Lewis, who listened without a flicker of doubt, her eyes focused, her pen ready. When she arrived at the house later that day, Emma was already there, moving through the kitchen with an effortless composure that tried too hard to be casual. She smiled when she saw the detective, her hands folded, voice smooth, almost amused. "It's a conspiracy," she said lightly, almost too lightly. "You've made a mistake. This is ridiculous. You're imagining things." Her words were practiced, polished, the performance of someone accustomed to disbelief bending to their will. I stood behind the detective, calm, steady, every detail of her demeanor memorized. Then Detective Lewis began to lay out the evidence. Videos, messages, plans, each one carefully documented, each one pointing to deliberate intent. Emma's face changed. The confident smile faltered. Her voice caught once, then fell silent. It was the first time I had ever seen her completely unprepared, stripped of all the rehearsed charm, all the manipulation. She looked smaller, exposed in a way that was almost satisfying, but mostly terrifying, because for the first time, the predator I had been observing for years was vulnerable. The officers moved with precision, handcuffing her in the very kitchen where she had tried to disguise malice as affection. I watched silently, heart steady, noting the slight tremor in her fingers, the tightness in her jaw. Every expression, every shift, had been catalogued, now frozen in undeniable truth. For the first time in years, silence filled the room. Not the quiet that masks danger, but the silence that follows certainty, when deception has been stripped away and the world finally matches reality. I didn't cry. There was no need. I felt empty, yes, but also resolved. A chapter had closed, but the lessons remained. And in that silence, a single question echoed, louder than any scream or shout: how had I not seen it sooner? How had I allowed my love, my trust, my protection to be weaponized against those I cared for most? I realized, with a painful clarity, that the daughter I had thought I had loved and nurtured may never have truly existed. What I had loved was an idea, a mask, a carefully constructed performance. The real person, the predator, had been there all along, learning, observing, calculating. The officers moved Emma out, and I watched from the doorway. The street outside was quiet, the morning sun casting long shadows across the pavement. She glanced back once, eyes flickering with something like hatred, recognition, or perhaps fear. It didn't matter. The truth had been revealed. Justice, in some form, had been enacted. I walked back into the kitchen, the space now devoid of menace, now a testament to clarity and survival. The ordinary objects, the table, the plates, the chairs, stood witness to a night that had redefined everything. I could touch them again without fear, move among them without the constant vigilance of imminent threat. It was over. Not neatly, not perfectly, but over. And yet, a sense of unease lingered, the kind that comes from knowing how close one came to catastrophe and how easily trust can be weaponized. I had survived because I had listened to instinct, because I had acted decisively, and because I had recognized the red flags long before the consequences became irreversible. In that aftermath, I understood the full spectrum of what had transpired. Manipulation, exploitation, malice, all had been present, all had been masked under the guise of love and familial bonds. And yet, by documenting, observing, and acting without hesitation, I had reclaimed control. I had transformed fear into a tool for safety. The day continued, but time seemed suspended. Neighbors whispered outside, curious glances toward the house. I remained inside, aware of every sound, every movement. Every echo of the past, the betrayals, the small lies, the omissions, was catalogued in my mind, reinforcing a newfound vigilance. I sat for hours afterward, contemplating the events, reviewing every sequence, every detail. The weight of what could have happened pressed down on me, but the clarity of survival was empowering. I understood that boundaries were necessary, vigilance non-negotiable, and trust conditional. Love alone was no safeguard. By evening, the house felt reclaimed. The threat removed. I was alone, yet not helpless. I had faced deception in its most intimate form, uncovered the predator, and ensured accountability. And in that certainty, I finally allowed myself a measure of peace. After that day, the house was silent. The kind of silence that doesn't hum with expectation or possibility, but hangs heavy, like air caught between walls. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I only felt an emptiness that spread slowly, filling every corner where trust had once lived. I wandered through the rooms, touching surfaces I had cleaned 1,000 times, staring at the objects I had loved and protected, now tinged with the memory of betrayal. Each chair, each plate, each carefully placed ornament carried the weight of what had occurred, the danger that had lurked unnoticed, the predator who had worn the face of my child. Questions echoed endlessly in my mind. How did I not see it? How could I have defended someone capable of so much calculation, so much manipulation? Every excuse I had made, every rationalization, every act of love that ignored warning signs now appeared in a harsh, unforgiving light. I realized, with a deep, quiet clarity, that the daughter I had known was never fully real. The girl I had nurtured, the child I had protected, had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. And in some ways, perhaps, I never truly had a daughter, only a reflection of my own hopes, my own desires, my own unwillingness to see the truth. I thought about all the times I had allowed her actions to go unquestioned. Every lie I had excused. Every manipulation I had rationalized. Every time I had prioritized love over caution. It had led to this, a life-threatening moment at my own table, a reality where instinct and intuition were the only things standing between survival and catastrophe. Yet, within that emptiness, a strange form of relief began to emerge. Relief that I had survived. Relief that I had acted, that I had trusted my instincts when it mattered most. Relief that the truth had been exposed, that justice, slow, imperfect, but real, was now in motion. I walked slowly to the window and looked out at the evening sky. The rain had stopped. Streetlights reflected on wet asphalt, illuminating the quiet neighborhood. I allowed myself a small acknowledgement of the weight lifted. The predator was no longer free to maneuver unseen. The danger had been confronted. But the lessons lingered. Love does not always protect. Trust can be exploited. The people we cherish, the family we nurture, can sometimes become the source of our deepest threat. And the only real safeguard is awareness, vigilance, and the courage to act when instinct demands it. I moved through the house deliberately, examining every small detail, noting the places where I had been blind, and where I had allowed trust to outweigh caution. Each memory, each observation, became a lesson etched into my mind. I would not forget. I could not. I thought about my own role in the events. The patience, the love, the unwavering protection I had offered. They had been weapons in the wrong hands, but they had also been proof of my own integrity. I had acted with moral clarity when it mattered, and that, perhaps, was the most enduring evidence of who I truly was. The night deepened, and with it, a stillness that was not empty but filled with understanding. I had survived. I had observed. I had acted. And I had emerged from the shadow of betrayal with the awareness to never be so vulnerable again. I realized, finally, that the loss I felt was not merely fear or grief. It was the recognition of the truth: I had loved someone who did not exist in the form I had imagined. And in acknowledging that, I reclaimed a measure of myself I had long surrendered. I moved to a small town by the ocean, far from the shadows that had haunted me for years. The salt air was clean, the horizon wide and steady, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the subtle comfort of being truly unseen. No manipulations, no hidden dangers, just wind, water, and space to breathe. I began helping adoptive parents, guiding them through paperwork, sharing wisdom earned through hardship, and offering the kind of advice that comes from experience rather than theory. I held support meetings in a small, sunlit community center, where people shared openly, and trust was given, not assumed. The ocean became a rhythm to my days. I walked along the shore, feeling the grit of sand between my fingers, the cold water brushing against my shoes, the endless blue reflecting my own slow, steady heartbeat. It reminded me that life continues, even after trauma, even after betrayal. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who loved me not for my resources or my ability to solve problems, but for my strength, my resilience, and my capacity to listen without judgment. I learned that safety is not always a place but a state of being, something cultivated, defended, and cherished. Each day, I told the truth of my experiences, carefully, intentionally. Not for revenge, but as a shield and a guide. People listened. They learned. And in helping them, I healed a part of myself that had been broken by trust misused. I learned that boundaries are sacred, that protection is not always about shielding others from consequences, and that sometimes, the strongest act is to let go of those who wield your love as a weapon. The ocean kept time. The small town offered perspective. And I finally understood that freedom is not the absence of danger, but the presence of control over one's own life, one's own choices, and one's own heart. This story taught me something crucial: love does not mean blindness. Sometimes the strongest act is to stop protecting evil, to trust your instincts, and to walk away. Names, locations, and details have been changed to protect privacy, but the lessons remain. Guard your heart, set boundaries, and never ignore the quiet alarms your intuition raises. Survival and self-respect are often forged in moments of courage and clarity. Tell me in the comments, could you believe a truth like this? Have you ever sensed danger in someone you trusted? And subscribe for more real stories about betrayal, strength, and new beginnings, because understanding the hidden patterns in human behavior can save lives.